privileged to introduce our speaker today. Earlier in the year, President Maryland pulled me aside and said, Mary, I'd love to get some diverse perspectives, some new speakers that we haven't heard from, perhaps some think tanks, elected officials, etc. You guys know my background. I was happy to oblige. And so today we have with us Preston Brashers from the Heritage Foundation. Preston is an analyst focused on tax policy. His research centers on tax and fiscal reform to promote economic growth, simplify taxation, and reduce the role of the federal government in Americans' everyday lives. So he's going to talk to us a little bit about the research that he's done, what he's seeing in the marketplace. You may have noticed he's been featured on numerous news outlets over the years, a plethora of TV appearances and more, and guest show on a number of radio shows. So prior, he spent some time at PwC, one of the firms that we work with in the industry. And then, of course, prior to that was with the Department of Revenue in the state of Washington. So we're pleased to have Preston with us here today, and I know we're going to have a robust dialogue. Be sure to get those questions ready. Thank you so much.
It is an honor to be here at a time in our society, in our country, where I think there's a lot of discord. It's a blessing to be here to speak with a group that I know brings together people from a lot of different perspectives, different worldviews, to advance goodwill, to solve problems, and to strengthen communities. So you remind me that most of us are united by a common desire to see people flourish. In this town, maybe there's people that have different perspectives about what human flourishing might look like and the best way to get there. But today I would like to talk about human flourishing, about civil society, about government, and about taxes. So it's April 5th. We're less than 2 weeks away from tax day. So if you haven't thought about your taxes yet, maybe now's the time to do so. I imagine many of you have already had taxes on your mind. But what are we paying for when we pay our taxes? Famously, in a 1927 court ruling, Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote that taxes are what we pay for civilized society. It's certainly true that the core functions of government, things like a well-functioning justice system, a strong national defense, they're necessary to avoid anarchy, foreign invasion, and a lot of other societal ills. But in 1927, when Holmes was writing, you could make a more compelling case that taxes were what we paid for civilized society. The federal government then was more focused on those constitutional functions, and the government was a fraction of the size that it is today. Federal outlays were about 3% of GDP. By 2028, 5 years from now, the Congressional Budget Office forecasts that federal outlays just on the interest payments on the national debt will exceed 3%. So let that sink in. Soon, Americans will spend more of their total income on interest payments on the national debt than Americans spent a century ago to fund the entire federal government as a percentage of income. So for some reason, the phrase taxes are the price we pay for civilized society and to service interest payments on the national credit card has yet to catch on. And all too often, the programs that our tax dollars fund today do not, in fact, make for a more civilized society. Instead, they crowd out the very institutions that define a civilized society. When government takes a more active role in society, one unfortunate consequence is that volunteer organizations, churches, charities, private service organizations, and even family structures can often take a back seat. Who do Americans look to today to solve society's ills? Who is primarily responsible for assisting a community member that is struggling financially? Who should we look to ensure that kids are getting a good education, or to ensure that we have safe and clean communities? Who ultimately can address our growing mental health crisis in this country? I contend that building a better society happens from the local grassroots level up, and not from top-down government programs. The primary responsibility for building civilization lies with individuals, families, churches, synagogues, other faith-based institutions, and private service organizations like this one. Sadly, the type of private civic engagement that holds America together is in decline. Only 27% of Americans in a recent Wall Street Journal poll said that community involvement is very important to them. That's less than half of what said that just in 2019. In a recent speech, one politician said, "We the people are the government, you and I. And with all due respect, most Americans feel that there is a vast chasm between ourselves and the elected officials and bureaucrats that represent us." A June 2022 Pew Research survey found that only 20% of Americans trust the government to do what is right, at least most of the time. And so, since Americans don't resonate to the idea that we, the people, are the government, when the task of building civilization is outsourced to the government, we lose the sense that we, ourselves, are fundamentally responsible for building civil society. This has bad consequences, not only for those civil institutions, but also for the individuals who could be living more fulfilling, purpose-filled lives if they were more actively engaged in building up their communities. As the proverb says, a generous person will prosper. Whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. Now, you might say to yourself, if people are increasingly distrustful of the government, doesn't that provide an opening for people and private organizations to take on a more active role in building civil society? And perhaps it could. But in addition to taking away people's sense of duty to act as their brother's keeper, the government also takes and redistributes the fruit of people's labor, leaving even conscientious people with far less time and fewer resources to give. Government expenditures, that is to say, taxes we must pay now or taxes we will pay in the future, including federal, state, and local, were 42.4% of GDP in 2021. So there's a very real sense in which the average American worker labors for more than 5 months out of the year to fund government programs, mostly transfer payments in one form or another. As a thought experiment, imagine if Americans had most of that time back, and they dedicated their talents and their energies for months out of the year to directly serving their communities and providing for their neighbors in need. How much stronger could civil society be? Of course, most people don't feel like they work 5 months out of the year to fund the federal government or fund the government. After all, when tax day comes around, the system is set up such that most people receive a check from the IRS instead of the other way around. And even the highest federal income tax rate is currently 37%, or 40.8% depending on the type of income. But most people pay significantly lower on their federal income taxes. So how is it that the government can claim 5/12 of the typical American's hard-earned treasure without people really being aware of it? There are three main ways that Americans are taxed more than they realize. One, there are many layers of taxation. Two, many taxes are hidden out of sight of the typical American. And three, the federal government can effectively tax us with debt and inflation. So first, there are many layers of taxation. Part of the reason there are many layers of taxation is there are many layers of government. You've got federal, state, county, city. The federal government taxes wage income, payroll, and some forms of employee compensation, capital gains income, corporate income, gifts and estates, imports, and sales of specific products like gasoline, alcohol, cigarettes. And if you happen to live in a US state, you will also pay state taxes. Most US states impose a personal income tax, including capital gains, a corporate income tax, sales tax, property tax, and various excise taxes and taxes on motor vehicles, hotels, and car rentals, and the like. And cities and counties, of course, layer on their own taxes, which vary by state, but the biggest source of revenue for localities is the property tax. But beyond the levels of government, even if you just look at federal income, there are multiple layers of taxes that apply to the same dollar. There are, of course, payroll taxes and personal income taxes applied to the same dollar of income. But then if someone decides to practice delayed gratification and saves and invests, and they put that money, say, in corporate stock, there will be 2 more taxes that are applied to them before he ever spends a penny. First, the business he invests in will be taxed on any income that dollar generates through taxes on corporate profits, and that will leave less after-tax profit to be split between investors. And then, when he sells the stock or receives a dividend, he'll face additional tax at the quote-unquote lower capital gains rate. As an aside, people sometimes refer to capital gains taxes as having a preferential rate. It's 15 or 20% at the federal level plus state. But that's kind of like saying that a person that's giving someone a lashing went easy on them because the last strike wasn't quite as hard as the ones before. If I asked everyone in the second point is that many taxes are just hidden. I think if I asked everyone in this room to tell me if they knew how much tax they paid last year, my guess is almost nobody could say with any confidence what they paid exactly, or probably even within, say, $100. A lot, unless you paid 0. People in many ancient and medieval cultures would probably have a better sense of the taxes that they pay and what the government is costing them, because back then, taxes were administered more directly. The government might send a tax collector to take a share of the crop that a local farmer grew, or the tax authorities might set a tax booth up, and people would have to come and pay the taxes they were required to pay. And so it was a little bit more concrete. By contrast, today's taxes are often out of sight and out of mind. Somewhere along the way, governments have figured out that people are less attached to money that they haven't seen yet. So, to remove some of the angst that people feel about taxes on wages, they set up automatic withholding of both income taxes and payroll taxes. And nowadays, taxes are even more hidden since the vast majority of US workers receive their paychecks through direct deposit, and many of us rarely, if ever, look at our pay stubs. And even if we did happen to glance at our pay stubs, there's a major tax, or at least half of that tax, that doesn't appear on that stub. The FICA lines on pay stubs, which represent the payroll taxes that fund Social Security and Medicare, appear on pay stubs as a 7.65% tax on employee wages. But this is only the employee side of the payroll tax. Employers are also taxed 7.65% on the wages they pay you, but you won't find this on your pay stub. The employer and the employee side of the payroll tax is a distinction without a difference. If your employer must pay you $107.65 in order for you to receive $92.35, that's a 15.3% tax, no matter what your pay stub says. The distinction between taxes on businesses and taxes on individuals more broadly is also more imaginary than it is real. Ultimately, only people can pay taxes because only people have needs and wants and consume resources. So when the government takes or redistribute resources, it's ultimately people that will be deprived. I think this is easier to see if we imagine a moneyless society in which the government takes 10% of all the food that farms produce. In that case, farmers would have 10% less food with which to pay the workers in the fields, to sell to customers, and to eat themselves. There would quite simply be less food to go around. So the workers, the consumers, and the farmers would all be left with less. The same concept is equally true in a world where we measure goods and services with dollars and cents. Taxing businesses means taxing people, and yes, we all pay. And there are countless other ways we pay without being aware of it. Consumers don't see the tariffs that they ultimately pay on imported goods. Drivers don't see the federal and state gas and diesel taxes that are imposed. Renters seldom think about the fact that property taxes are being passed on to them. People with retirement accounts probably don't think about stock buyback taxes affecting them, but of course, if it's affecting, if you're taxing financial transactions and that's devaluing people's wealth, that will apply to retirees as well, and the list goes on. And the third category of ways that Americans pay more taxes than we realize, namely through debt and inflation, is really a subcategory of the last one. It's the hidden taxes. It's a form of a hidden tax that we just went through, but it's important enough, I think, to warrant its own discussion. The debt we accrue as a country will eventually be repaid one way or another. The obvious way that can happen is through future taxes. Currently, our national tab stands at about $31.5 trillion. That's about $250,000 per household. On the current trajectory, that number will rise exponentially as a larger and larger share of the population retires and begins drawing on Social Security and Medicare benefits. By the 2050s, that will be, based off CBO projections, likely close to $1 million per household. So unless Congress starts to curb its spending, should we all get ready to start forking over more money to the IRS on future tax days? Maybe, but not necessarily. No politician wants to call for a massive tax hike on the middle class, which is exactly what this addressing this issue would require. And there is a sneakier, and I'd say more pernicious way that the government can deal with the debt problem, and that's through inflation. The government is obligated to pay its creditors $31.5 trillion, but notice that the debt that the country owes is denominated in dollars. It's a specific unit of measure. And it just so happens that the government, namely the Federal Reserve, can control how much value each dollar has by using its tools to increase the number of dollars in circulation. You can turn a ton of debt into a pound of debt if you are willing and able to redefine the system of weights and measures. But that, of course, leaves everyone that's holding assets denominated in US dollars holding the bag. That is to say, most Americans. Once again, Americans may not go to a tax booth to directly pay this inflation tax, but one way or another, it's coming out of our pockets. As we discovered over the last 3 years, inflation comes at a heavy price, no pun intended, and it ends up being every bit as much a tax on the poor as it is a tax on the rich. So what are the takeaways? The price we pay for government is high and growing. The price of government is more than just what we pay on tax day. It also consists of what amount to hidden fees on almost everything we do in the economy, what we buy, what we sell, when we work, when we invest. All those direct and indirect taxes add up. And the price we pay for government is a burden that we all share. Now, I'm sure that even if we had a full accounting of the price that we all pay for government, many would continue to support not only the current level of government spending, some would want to increase the level of government spending. Some are just more open to a more expansive role for government than others are. Given our ideological divides, is there a way to get back to being a proper country that is united in spite of these differences? The short answer is that I'm optimistic we can. It would be easier if we returned back to our Federalist roots, though. Our system was originally set up as a Federalist system. The 10th Amendment says that the powers not delegated to the federal government by the Constitution are reserved to the states and to the people. And yet, somehow today it feels like the federal government has all the power. I mentioned earlier that in the 1920s, federal spending amounted to only about 3% of GDP, or barely a tenth of the 25 to 31% that we spent in each of the last 3 years. But what I didn't mention was that in those days, state and local governments spent more than the federal government did, which is the opposite of what happens today. And one of the advantages when states and localities control most of the public finances and hold most of the government power is that people have more control over how they're governed. If you really don't like the way that you're being governed, if you would really prefer a more expansive government or a more limited government, you can always just move. In contrast, it's much harder to get out from the federal Leviathan. Devolving more power back to the states would strengthen communities, as government leaders who are closer to the people can be more responsive to their constituents than federal lawmakers can. It would also ease national tensions if the legislation that affected Americans' lives the most was happening not in Washington, D.C., but in state capitals across the country. We live in a vast and great country, but what makes us strong isn't centralized powers. It's families, it's communities, it's local civil institutions. And even as someone who works in public policy in a center that is focused on the federal budget, I long to see a day when Americans are free to focus more on what's happening close to home than what's happening in the White House or at the US Capitol. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much for the insightful presentation that you have just picked up of what used to be spent by 1920, which is 100 years ago, 3% and something like that. That is very good. My question to you, sir, is now that people had been projecting on what's to come through the research and everything.
Sorry, through the...
Now that they had been projecting on what's to come in your research. Now, recently, there is something that is talk in the news that the IRS funding will be dried up by 2033. Where is the missing link there? That's where my question is.
So just some factual things on that, I guess. So in terms of the IRS funding, the IRS funding, as you may know, was increased by about $80 billion under the Inflation Reduction Act. So that was over the course of the next 10 years. So there was a bit of a decline in IRS funding leading up to that, but of course that $80 billion of additional funding almost doubles the amount of funding for the IRS. So at this point, I don't think that there's much risk of the IRS funding drying up. And I think there's a couple things to think about with the IRS. I think there's of course the enforcement side of things, and if you look at it, where most of the funding that the Inflation Reduction Act dedicated to the IRS, it was predominantly for enforcement. There was about $46 billion out of the $80 billion, and comparatively, there was I believe about $3 billion that went towards customer service. I think most people on the right and the left can probably get behind allowing the additional customer service. I think there is reason for attention and concern about an expanded IRS. If we're putting all this money into the IRS, again, I talked about how this money is coming out somewhere, and if you're thinking about what's going to happen if there's more IRS scrutiny, yes, you'll probably catch some taxpayers that you should be catching, but not everyone that the IRS audits is a tax cheat. We all know this. And everyone's going to have to apply be a lot more careful when they're filing their taxes. Companies are going to have bigger tax teams and accounting teams to make sure they're filing everything correctly, and that's a cost that gets passed along. So all these things, I think, you kind of have to look at it holistically, and so there is a balance that we have to strike in terms of the IRS funding.
Thank you for such an informative presentation. My question is, given it's so unlikely that Americans, politicians will ever reach agreement on the solution to the issues you laid out, is it possible for us to work our way in the right direction through innovation in this country? And how likely is that scenario, percentage-wise, in your estimation?
I don't know about a percentage, but I think that's a very astute point. It is hard to come to agreement about spending levels, for example. But I think there's probably maybe a little bit more room where there are some pro-growth things that I think that people can agree on, both on the right and on the left. Some things that might spur innovation. One of the things that I think is important for innovation is investments in innovation. So one of the big policies that we would encourage is expensing. So this is something that was part of TCJA, but it's kind of in the process of expiring. So basically, what that meant was businesses, when they invested in capital or capital expenses, if they buy machinery or factory equipment, they were able to deduct that right away. Which generally that's the way it works, right? You have an expense, you're able to deduct that. But the way that it used to be, and the way that it's kind of gradually going back to now, is that we extend this out over a very long period of time, where it may be 27 years, 25 years before we're able to deduct that expense. So it's a big disincentive for companies to invest in things that might help us innovate as a country. And there's something similar that unfortunately is happening with R&D, where we've moved now to a 5-year amortization instead of allowing companies to deduct those R&D expenses. So I think there are some things there. I think there are some things in the regulation space that we can probably agree on. Even if we can't all come to agreement necessarily, again, on the spending level, I think there are some things that we can do that can stimulate growth, and that can help. All these things that we talk about when we're talking about the budget, we're talking about things usually in terms of as a percentage of GDP. One of the great things you can do is if you bump up that GDP, the debt numbers don't look quite as bad. The taxes don't look quite as bad if we're able to grow our economy. So yes, I think that's a great point.
Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. When it comes to government, I'm with you. Less is more. I appreciate your points regarding the hidden taxation, and also your points regarding the absolute cost of taxes, including inflation. However, I found your presentation to be grievance-based. My question to you is, are you in favor at the Heritage of gridlock or not? And if not, what do you think about the rules of the Senate, about how people can hold up legislation, and the practices of the House, where anything out of the purview of what the Speaker wants doesn't get done? Would you care to comment on our ineffective Congress?
We have a system that I think is designed to move slowly. That's why we have a government where we have different branches of power. We have the executive, we have the legislative, we have the judicial. And we have two branches of government, of Congress, that can make for things to be dysfunctional at times. I don't know that I would say, I certainly wouldn't say that we're in favor of gridlock per se, but then again, gridlock can be better than the alternative if you're trying to do things that are really bad for the country. So I guess I'd have to have a little bit more specifics about if there's something in particular that you're referring to.
How is Heritage looking to make Congress more effective as opposed to complaining?
Okay. It's a fair criticism that is very easy to criticize. We're absolutely in favor of reaching compromises. I think we're going to have some debt ceiling discussions. Again, there are some that are going to come in and ask for the moon. Presumably, we're probably going to meet somewhere in the middle, and I think there's a bit of both, where we have to, we're all for incremental steps towards reducing the size of the federal government. We're all for incremental steps towards getting regulations off of businesses' backs. We're very much in favor of any steps that can do that. So we're not for gridlock in a way that it would impose our values.
I'd just like to talk a bit about state versus federal.
Yeah.
Not exactly in the terms of taxation, but California adopted some pretty stringent rules with respect to automobiles. And there was a waiver from the federal government to allow them to do that. And then there was a strong conservative reaction that said, no, we ought to stick with the EPA rules and not have disparate rules around the country. So that's an issue about if you let things go to the states, they'll do things that will be disruptive when they don't coincide with the policies of other states. So how do you address the issue of uniformity, which is necessary, and diversion, which is possible?
Yeah, there's obviously there is a role for the federal government. I think when we think about the Interstate Commerce Clause, some of those things maybe fall into the Interstate Commerce Clause when you're talking about things that literally you have to have some sort of synchronization, and so that's in the Constitution. So it's not a matter of going 100% from our current system to devolving everything back to the states. Of course, there is a role for the federal government, but we're certainly very far, I think, from the ideal. That I think we our default assumption is that the federal government has the power, and the states are basically allowed to do whatever the federal government allows them to do. And so I think we need to move more to a system where the default is the opposite. Unless there is a clear need for the federal government to step in and mediate these differences in commerce or whatever it is, then I think we should be trying to devolve it to the states where we can.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Just a question about the divergent political mentalities that exist in the country, the conservatives, the liberals. Is the future of the republic, the United States, in jeopardy, on a course of destruction, ultimately, if these parties continue to push far right and far left, in your judgment?
There's a saying that we're always one generation away, and so you never know. Obviously, that things could go south if we continue to kind of diverge into our camps and we don't try to find some common ground. So so as much as I have my beliefs, I think we should treat people with respect, and that's something I like about this organization. You're bringing people together from different perspectives to talk about these issues. I imagine there's a lot of people in the room that don't agree with me, and that's fine. And hopefully we can get back to a point where, as a country, it's okay that we can disagree on these things. And that's where I think there is a little bit of, it'd be great if we essentially, to the extent we are moving into camps, I think federalism works so much better in that system. And I think as a country, that's been the model a little bit. There have always been pretty big differences across the country. What's that? The genius. Yes, the genius of our country, absolutely. That it allows, even where there's very, very stark differences, we still are united. We still need to have a common defense. We're stronger together and united, even if we have very, very big differences, and we'd like to be self-governed a little bit differently.
Please. On behalf of the Rotary Club of Washington, D.C. and our Trees for the Capital program, I'm pleased and proud to present you with this certificate signifying our commitment to plant a tree in your honor. Right. And we're very high tech. We have GPS coordinates, so we'll send you the link and you'll be able to type your name, and you'll see in the city, in our nation's capital. Thank you so much.